The house had grown too quiet after her son was gone, as if even the walls had learned to hold their breath. Every morning, she woke at the same hour, out of habit rather than purpose, her eyes opening to a ceiling that no longer felt like shelter. The other side of the house remained untouched, his room preserved exactly as he had left it. His books still rested on the desk, a jacket hung carelessly on the chair, and a faint trace of his scent lingered in the air, refusing to fade completely. Her days moved slowly, almost mechanically. She would make tea for two, then pause, staring at the extra cup before pouring it back into the pot. Meals were simple, often forgotten. Conversations had disappeared from her life, replaced by long stretches of silence that pressed heavily against her chest. Time didn't feel like it was passing. It felt like it had stopped the day she lost him. The only place where she allowed herself to feel anything anymore was the cemetery. There, beside the neatly carved stone that carried his name, she spoke freely. She told him about her days, about the neighbors, about how much she missed hearing his laughter echo through the house. Sometimes she smiled through her tears, remembering the smallest things, how he used to tease her, the way his voice softened when he called her Amy. That morning, she stood by the window longer than usual, holding a fresh bouquet of white lilies in her hands. It was his birthday. Her fingers tightened slightly around the stems as a strange, unexplainable feeling settled in her heart. After weeks of routine visits, something about today felt different. Without fully understanding why, she picked up her bag and stepped out, deciding to visit his grave once again, unaware that this time, something unexpected was waiting for her. The cemetery gates creaked softly as she pushed them open, the familiar sound echoing through the stillness. Usually, this place carried a quiet kind of peace, a silence that felt almost comforting in its predictability. But today was different. The air felt heavier, as though something unseen lingered between the rows of graves. Even the wind seemed hesitant, brushing lightly against the trees without making a sound. She tightened her grip on the bouquet of lilies as she walked down the narrow path, her steps slower than usual. A strange unease settled in her chest, though she couldn't explain why. Her eyes instinctively moved toward the place she knew so well, the spot where her son rested. But as she got closer, her footsteps faltered. Someone was already there. At first, she thought it might be a stranger who had wandered too close by mistake, but the figure didn't move away. Instead, he stood directly in front of her son's grave, as if he belonged there. He was tall, dressed in an expensive, perfectly tailored suit that seemed out of place in the quiet, somber setting. Everything about him spoke of wealth and power, his posture, his polished appearance, the way he carried himself. But he wasn't alone. A small child stood beside him, no more than 5 or 6 years old, clutching his hand. The child looked up at the grave with innocent curiosity, occasionally glancing at the man as if trying to understand his emotions. And then she noticed it, the man was crying. Not quietly, not with restraint, but completely, uncontrollably broken. His shoulders trembled, his face buried in his hand as tears streamed freely. It was the kind of grief that couldn't be hidden, the kind that stripped away pride and composure. She stopped where she was, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Who was this man, and why was he standing at her son's grave? For a few seconds, she couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the ground, her fingers tightening around the bouquet as her eyes remained fixed on the stranger. Then, gathering what little strength she had, she forced herself forward, each step slow and uncertain, the sound of gravel beneath her shoes breaking the silence. The man seemed to sense her presence. He quickly straightened, wiping his face with the back of his hand as if trying to erase the evidence of his grief. His posture stiffened, his expression shifting into something controlled, something guarded, but his red, swollen eyes betrayed him. When their eyes met, the air between them grew heavy. Neither spoke at first. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and tense, filled with unspoken questions. She was the one who finally broke it. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though it carried the weight of everything she had lost. "How do you know my son?" The question lingered between them. The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a moment, it seemed as though he might not answer at all. His gaze dropped briefly to the ground, then shifted toward the grave, as if searching for the right words there. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, unsteady. "I knew him," he said, but the words felt incomplete, hollow. She frowned slightly, her instincts sharpening. That wasn't an answer, it was an avoidance. There was something in his tone, in the way his hands clenched at his sides, that told her he was holding back far more than he was saying. Beside him, the child remained unaware of the tension building between the two adults. He stared quietly at the gravestone, tracing the engraved letters with curious eyes, as if trying to understand their meaning. The mother took another step closer, her heart beginning to race. She could feel it now, something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. Before she could press further, the child suddenly spoke, his small voice clear and innocent. "Papa comes here every day." The words seemed to echo far louder than it should have. For a moment, even the air felt like it had stopped moving. The mother's breath caught in her throat as her eyes snapped toward the child, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. "Papa?" she repeated faintly, the single word trembling as it left her lips. The child nodded innocently, completely unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. He pointed toward the grave with a small, certain gesture. "He's my papa," he said simply, as if it were the most natural truth in the world. Everything inside her shifted. Her fingers loosened, and the bouquet nearly slipped from her grasp. The ground beneath her felt unsteady, as though it might give way at any second. Her son had a child? A child she had never known about, never even imagined? A wave of emotions crashed over her all at once. Shock, confusion, hurt, disbelief. Questions flooded her mind faster than she could hold on to them. Why hadn't he told her? How could something this important remain hidden? And who was this man standing in front of her, carrying a truth that had never reached her? Her gaze snapped back to the man, now sharper, more demanding. "What is he saying?" she asked, her voice rising despite her effort to stay composed. "Tell me the truth. Right now." The man's face tightened, the carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack. His eyes dropped, unable to meet hers for more than a second. The guilt she had sensed earlier was no longer hidden. It was written plainly across his expression, in the tension of his jaw, in the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. He exhaled slowly, as if bracing himself for something inevitable. The silence stretched again, heavier this time, filled with truths that could no longer be avoided. When he finally looked up, there was no escape left in his eyes. "I need to tell you everything." For a long moment, he said nothing, as if the weight of the truth was too heavy to release all at once. Then he let out a slow, unsteady breath, his gaze drifting toward the gravestone before him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, stripped of the authority he once carried so easily. "Your son, he wasn't just someone I knew," he began, pausing as if each word demanded effort. "He was someone who changed my life in ways I didn't understand until it was too late." The mother stood still, her eyes fixed on him, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. "He was in a relationship," the man continued, his tone soft but filled with regret. "With my daughter." The words hit her like a sudden storm. She blinked, trying to grasp what she was hearing. Her son had loved someone, deeply enough to keep it hidden, and she had never known. "I didn't approve," the man admitted, his jaw tightening slightly. "I thought he wasn't good enough for her. He didn't come from our world. I believed I was protecting her, protecting our family." His voice cracked faintly. "But I was wrong." He looked down at the child, his expression softening with pain. "They loved each other, more than I was willing to see. When I found out how serious it had become, I did everything I could to separate them. I used my influence, my power. I made sure they stayed apart." The mother felt her chest tighten, anger beginning to rise beneath the shock. "They didn't stop," he continued quietly. "They found ways to stay in touch, to hold on to what they had." And then he hesitated, swallowing hard. There was an accident. The word hung heavily between them. They were on their way to meet each other, he said, his voice breaking now. My daughter survived, but your son, he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. She was already pregnant, he added after a moment, barely above a whisper. She gave birth to his child, and not long after, I lost her too. Illness. Complications we couldn't stop. The child stood quietly, unaware of the tragedy woven into his existence. I was left with him, the man said, his voice hollow. With everything I had tried to destroy, now becoming the only thing I had left of them. The mother's mind reeled, each piece of the story settling into place with painful clarity. Her son's hidden life, the love he had fought for, the child she never knew existed, it all crashed over her at once. She stood there, unable to speak, her grief no longer just sorrow but something deeper, heavier, now tangled with shock, betrayal, and a growing, burning anger. The man's composure finally gave way completely. The strength he had been clinging to slipped, and he sank slightly where he stood, his shoulders trembling again. But this time, he didn't try to hide it. The grief came back, heavier than before, raw and unforgiving. For all his wealth, for all the power he once carried so effortlessly, he looked like a man who had nothing left inside him but regret. I thought I knew what was right, he said, his voice breaking openly now. I thought I could control everything, decide what was best for everyone. He let out a hollow, bitter laugh that quickly faded into silence. And in the end, I destroyed the only two people who truly mattered. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze fixed on the ground as if he couldn't bear to look at her anymore. I come here almost every day, he admitted quietly. Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes when no one is around. I stand here, and I try to find a way to forgive myself. His voice dropped even lower. But I can't. The child shifted closer to him, holding onto his hand with quiet trust. The man glanced down at him, his expression softening with a mixture of love and pain. He's all I have left of them, he said. I've tried to give him everything, comfort, security, a future. But no matter what I do, it never feels like enough. It never fixes what I've done. The contrast between them was impossible to ignore. He had money, influence, everything the world could offer, yet he stood there completely broken. And she, who had lost her son, still carried something he didn't have anymore, a love that remained pure, untainted by guilt. He slowly lifted his gaze to meet hers, his eyes filled with something fragile, uncertain. I know I don't deserve it, he said, his voice barely steady. But can you ever forgive me? For a long moment, she said nothing. His question lingered in the air, but it barely reached her through the storm building inside her. Her chest felt tight, her thoughts tangled between anger and heartbreak. She looked at the man in front of her, the one who had stood in the way of her son's happiness, who had taken choices into his own hands, and a sharp wave of resentment rose within her. But it wasn't just him. A deeper pain surfaced, one she hadn't expected. Her son had kept this from her. Something so big, so life-changing, and she had been left in the dark. The realization cut deeply. She had always believed they shared everything, that there were no secrets between them. And yet, here she stood, discovering a hidden part of his life only after he was gone. Her eyes shifted slowly, almost hesitantly, toward the child. He stood quietly, watching her with wide, curious eyes, completely unaware of the emotional weight surrounding him. There was no guilt in his expression, no fear, only innocence. And as she looked closer, something inside her softened. There was a familiarity in his face. The shape of his eyes, the slight curve of his smile, even the way he tilted his head, it was all so painfully familiar. Her breath caught as she realized what she was seeing. Her son was there, reflected in the small details of this child standing in front of her. A part of him had never truly left. Without thinking, she slowly lowered herself to her knees, bringing herself to the child's level. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair away from his forehead. Her eyes filled, but this time, the tears carried something different, something softer. In that moment, The choice stood clearly before her. She could hold onto the anger, reject everything tied to the pain, or she could accept this child, this unexpected piece of her son's life that had found its way back to her. After a quiet pause, she made her decision, without words, but with a simple, trembling touch that changed everything. She stayed kneeling for a moment longer, her hand resting gently near the child, as if afraid that any sudden movement might break the fragile silence between them. Her emotions were still heavy, grief, anger, disbelief, but beneath it all, something softer had begun to rise. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. The child looked at her quietly, sensing nothing of the storm that had just passed, only the warmth of her presence. Slowly, hesitantly, she extended her hand toward him. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was small, uncertain, but it carried everything she could not yet put into words. The child blinked, then, without hesitation, placed his tiny hand in hers. That simple touch shattered something inside her in the gentlest way possible. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she did not pull away. Instead, she held his hand a little more firmly, grounding herself in the reality that stood before her. A piece of her son alive, breathing, innocent, right there in her grasp. The millionaire stood a few steps away, watching silently. His face carried exhaustion, relief, and disbelief all at once. He had prepared himself for rejection, for anger that would never fade, but what he was witnessing now felt like something he hadn't dared to hope for. A beginning, not of forgiveness, but of acceptance. None of them spoke for a while. Words felt unnecessary in a moment that fragile. The wind moved gently through the cemetery, as if even nature had softened around them. The mother finally rose, still holding the child's hand. Her gaze drifted once more to the gravestone of her son. The pain was still there, deep and unhealed, but it no longer stood alone. Something else had joined it, something unexpected, complicated, but alive. In that quiet moment, the place that had always represented loss began to change. It was still a grave, still a reminder of everything that had been taken too soon, but now it also held something new. Not an ending anymore. A beginning. Life, in its quiet unpredictability, has a way of rewriting even the deepest sorrows. What once felt like an ending can slowly transform into something unrecognizable, something fragile, painful, yet strangely meaningful. Secrets that remain buried for years eventually rise to the surface, and regrets that once consumed a heart begin to shape a different kind of understanding. She had come to the cemetery for months, carrying only grief, speaking to a stone that could never answer her back. For her, the world had stopped the day she lost her son, and nothing afterward had felt real enough to matter. But now, things were different in ways she never could have imagined. Now, she no longer came alone. A small hand often held hers as she walked through the quiet path between the graves. The child would sometimes ask innocent questions, sometimes simply walk in silence beside her, as if he belonged there too. And in those moments, the pain in her chest did not disappear, but it softened, reshaped by a presence she never expected to have. At a distance, the millionaire would sometimes stand quietly, watching from afar. He did not try to intrude or force his way into their new reality. Instead, he remained a silent figure of remorse and responsibility, slowly learning what it meant to live with the consequences of his past choices. Over time, he no longer felt like a stranger hovering at the edge of their story, but someone cautiously stepping towards something he once destroyed. The mother still felt the weight of everything that had happened. The loss of her son would never fade, and the wounds would never fully close. But grief had begun to share its space with something unexpected: connection, responsibility, and a fragile sense of continuation. As she stood once more before her son's grave, the wind brushing gently against her face, she realized something she never thought she would feel again. The world had not ended with his absence. It had simply changed shape. And sometimes, even in the deepest grief, life leaves behind a reason to keep going.